Yeah, that's right. He's the cool uncle.
And I'm getting an alert that says your microphone appears to be noisy. So
And welcome to the Tolkien Society, our monthly meeting on the third Saturday of each month from 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Time. More information is at tolkienscholars.org and also on twitter.com/Tolkien Scholars. You can check out our previous month's meeting notes through all the years that we've been doing this. More than a decade, coming up like a decade in a lustrum.
Yes, indeed. And furthermore.
And today is October 16th, 2021. So, I'm Hawk Robinson, founder of the Ea Tolkien Society. We are an official smile of the UK Tolkien Society. We're based here in Spokane, Washington, the inland empire of the Northwest. Introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Anthony of the East Farthing. Born and raised here in Spokane, and I've been with this Tolkien group for about a little over 4 years now.
Yes, you're almost coming up to your 5-year anniversary.
Yay!
Fine company. Huzzah!
Toes never fall off.
And magic powers.
do you get a pen or something going over 5 years?
Yeah, there you go.
We don't have a budget, so we just get a congratulations.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Yes.
And
I am Brian Huseland, the Supreme Secretary of the Smile here.
And joining us online
is Gary Hackman, who first joined you from Anacortes, Washington. We've since moved to, I'm learning they pronounce it Boise. Like
oh, it's not a Z, it's an S.
Instead of, like the rest of us pronounce it Boise.
That's
Idaho, but actually I'm living down here in Mountain Home.
Okay.
It's a completely different climate than Puget Sound, but
Yeah.
the people here are really nice, and we're pretty well moved in.
Great.
You can see I do have something up on the wall now. So.
I have that exact map. So.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
That's a great one.
Yes.
So when you refer to anything, I can just get up and look around.
Wonderful.
Although,
yes, we do.
Mine came already mounted. So.
Yeah, so did mine. Yeah, I have the exact same one. It's a really good
Yeah,
one.
I want to get that.
Well, welcome everybody. Would you like me to read the notes from
Well, if you would, please.
September?
Yes, please.
And Hawk will he will fade in and out as if an apparition from Middle Earth. Yes. More like Tom Bombadil, actually.
There you go.
Kind of a Finnish.
Very mellow fellow.
Yeah.
Merry fellow.
That's right. He'll come stomping through with his boots or shoes or whatever, and then he'll be off again.
Although I don't have
Like
a yellow.
Like an ox through the lilies.
Yeah. That part, yeah, okay. Because of my stature. Stomp.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
So-
Yes, please take it away.
All right, great. Well, the notes for September 18, 2021. Corey, Anthony, Sarah, Jeremiah, and Gary attended. Brian read the August notes. The company drank a toast for Frodo and Bilbo's birthday. Hey!
Hey!
Cheers! Yes, Anthony read letter 188 from Tolkien. We had a discussion on author's intent. What gets lost? Sarah shares example of Strider's name in Italian. Troubles of translating fiction. Ah, yes. Corey read letter 189. And then we asked the question, when did you read Lord of the Rings for the first time? And we had a discussion and a friendly debate about, I don't know what. Apparently it was friendly. We read letter 190 and had a discussion on the trouble of translating place names. Tolkien was really bothered because of the Dutch first edition, the what would you call it? The rough, it wasn't the published copy yet. The draft. Yes, the draft for the Dutch translation. He was really quite put out, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that they had tried to translate these places literally, and he was pointing out that there's more to a name, whether it be a place or person, than just the literal meaning of that word. And so he was not very happy with Alan and Unwin. So he wanted to be consulted on these things before they got just translated or before they were published. And so we'll pick that up, of course, this month with letter 191 next. And then we had an update on the Amazon Lord of the Rings, lack of a better title since they haven't provided one. So the upcoming series, which is coming out next year at September. And so just kind of the fact that, officially in August they announced or more like hinted at their plans to include some material from the First Age, even if it's nothing more than a similar to the Lord of the Rings movies, having a little kind of flashback to prologue to when Isildur cuts the ring from Sauron's finger. So, and then we finished up that discussion a little bit about what's going on with that, our mixed feelings, both good and bad. And then our next meeting, of course, was to be on Saturday, October 16th from 1 to 3 p.m.
Which is now.
Which is now, exactly.
I feel like baseballs.
Exactly.
Where are we in the movie now? We're here now. Now is where we are now in the movie.
They're like looking for the script.
They went backwards and forwards through the video.
That's right.
Ludicrous speed.
Yeah, I forgot about that. So Hawk, you'll be monitoring, I assume, upstairs the chat.
Yes.
So if there's, you can. Do you want maybe Anthony? Do you want to be kind of responsible for that? I think last time you did a great job.
You can do that right. I'm trying to figure out how to do this in a way that.
But I think you had up the YouTube.
Oh, YouTube, yeah. The live.
Yeah, it's right here.
Yes. So if we want to, perhaps we can just have Anthony can kind of be your designated. You can. Okay. All right.
Looks like nobody.
That's fine.
We often are.
Oh, is there a place where I can plug my battery's running low? Is there a place I can plug this in?
There's a strip right here.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, just plug it in.
I'm just reaching out. It might be too late for them or whatever, but I am going to just send a quick note. I did.
Oh,
Send out the
okay.
emails.
It's a dice tray.
Oh, okay.
But it's with the map of Middle Earth.
Oh, okay. I thought it was, you put it out there, I thought it was for donations or something.
Yeah, well, we can use it for that too. I don't know if you saw this one. Actually,
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, where'd you get that one?
it was anniversary of birthday this year.
Oh, happy birthday.
Shoot. Oh, beautiful. That's for pens?
Well, whatever you
For
want.
dice.
But dice in
Yeah.
It's a dice tray.
That's a very nice dice tray.
Wooden dice tray.
Uh-huh.
Hold dice in it.
Hawk also has a great interest. Well, interest doesn't even really describe it. Along with Tolkien and many other interests, Hawk is quite focused on role-playing games and their recreational and therapeutic
Yep.
Therapeutic uses.
You
Yes.
got it.
So that's what all this is. But some of us are just excited about Tolkien, and some of us are both. Oh. Oh, yes. Found it.
Aha, there it is.
There it is.
Middle Earth and the Third Age. Okay.
Wonderful. Well, was there anything that you, before you go upstairs, is there anything you wanted to make sure that we covered today?
It was a tangent because this
Yep.
is coming up on Amazon Prime next month.
Really?
Or not this. Wheel of Time.
Robert Jordan.
Ah.
Yeah.
Robert Jordan. Sorry, but Brandon Sanderson took
He
over
finished
for
it,
Robert Jordan.
yeah.
Right. So
Maybe, like, so,
November something. It's out. So they've got a trailer out,
okay,
but it's Wheel of Time.
okay.
The series.
Okay.
On Amazon Prime starting next month.
That could be very interesting to see how they treat that.
Yeah, there's
That could be a big clue.
It's
Yes.
yeah, it's going to be very interesting.
Okay.
But that was just a little.
I'm not that familiar. I've never read anything by Robert Jordan.
Yeah.
I suggest. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
Probably puts me, I don't know. But anyway, Game of Thrones, right?
No, that would be George R.R. Martin.
Okay.
This predates.
I just said.
That's okay. It predates Game of Thrones. I think it was in the 80s that the first book
Yeah.
came out.
1990, 91.
Late 80s, yeah.
late
Something like that.
But he started
But-
writing
and I read the first book and really liked the first one a lot,
Yeah,
which
same
was Eye of the World
Yes.
was the first one, and that I really liked. And then my sons really got into it in the early 2000s, and they're like, Dad, you got to read this. And I'm like, well, I read the first one. I didn't know he came out with 10 other books. You know? So I started reading the others, and the second one was okay, and the third was okay, and then by the fourth and fifth, I started really having trouble getting
The
through it.
wheels in the sky keep on
Well, there is actually an unofficial album. Somebody put together an entire album soundtrack
No.
for the Wheel of
Really?
Time.
Really?
In that style, in exactly that
In
style.
exactly that
of
style.
rock. Yeah.
Journey.
Yeah, pretty much that style.
Hopefully,
it's
my,
unofficial.
my very poor imitation does not flag
It was
us on
fine.
YouTube.
Yeah, no kidding. Anyway, by the fifth one, I just couldn't get through it anymore, and I stopped midway through that book.
That's fair.
I found it really kind of dragged, and I just was not as engaged. But my sons loved it. But it is an interesting setting. It has interesting rules of magic.
So here's a thought.
Yes.
We could talk
So,
about it. We could
yeah.
talk about it this month,
Or
or
next time.
or what we could do is we could say that Robert Jordan would be our
for next month.
topic for November.
Yeah, that's what
Which
I'm
might
thinking.
be-
That's why I wanted to just bring that up.
Okay, so let's make
As
sure
an
that we do
adjunct
that.
to what you were planning.
And
Well,
you
just to
said
make-
that Amazon's coming down with a series?
Yeah, Amazon Prime. It's going to be on their video stream in November. It's Wheel of Time is the series,
Okay.
and it's high budget, and and the series is when you mention Game of Thrones, it has a Game of Thrones feel to it, except way more magic. But it was very much they called it the Game of Thrones. They called it, I think, just the game or something, which basically the same thing. And I'm not sure, but so it had a lot of political intrigue later. But initially, it's your typical farm boy, average person doesn't know that they're special, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And the key thing is that magic is only able to be wielded safely by women.
Yeah.
By the Aes Sedai.
Yeah.
They're the only ones who can do it safely. When men do it, they go crazy. That's the core
That's actually very old.
magic. It is. There's
concept.
support for that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there's a role playing game that came out years and years ago to it, and it's actually an interesting. It changes things up, so it's that way. It's a very broad character. As you go through the books, he kind of goes off in a lot of different character stories, and they kind of break up all over. So you end up. That's why it starts to slow down, because you end up in all these different locations in the world with all these different characters. And other than the initial main character, they all kind of feel like of equal. They all get a lot of focus. So it goes very broad, and it ended up being 13 books or something. The last few books had to be finished by a different author because the main author got a blood disease and passed away, but he had time to know that. Handed it over to Brandon Sanderson. So
Well, maybe that's one
That's
of
how
the
that all
one of the
ties
things
in.
that we can compare and contrast next month is
you-
the fact that authors often do not, like, their works kind of outlive them.
as Tolkien,
Yeah.
Right? You kind of
Yep.
don't have enough time to really,
yeah,
you know.
because of all the niggling.
Yeah, pretty much.
No.
So just kind of piggybacking onto what Hawk just brought up there, this had to do with the question I may have asked.
Proposal.
I think, a proposal, an addendum. No, a proposal before I think we started recording, which is that I propose that each month we choose a high fantasy author or fantasy author to compare and contrast with Tolkien. The goal of this would be to say, for example, this could be authors who were influenced by Tolkien, and really most fantasy authors have been simply because they had to decide how different to be and how similar to be, etc. And so you have both positive and negative vibes towards Tolkien from modern authors, but not necessarily all critical, right? And then also we could to add into the mix would be those fantasy authors which were in influence on Tolkien, or at least were part of the same milieu. So that's the idea. This month, I'm suggesting Brandon Sanderson, who is a contemporary fantasy author that a lot of people know, even if they don't know Tolkien.
He's been here in Spokane a number of times
Oh,
at Spokane.
Right.
He's been one of our guest speakers.
And then the connection with Robert Jordan in the Wheel of Time is because
So Brandon Sanderson became a popular top author on his own for whatever series. My sons loved that.
Mistborn.
As Robert Jordan was diagnosed with the blood disease and wasn't able to finish the book, and he knew he only had a few years left, started looking around for an author to take over with the help of his wife, because I guess his wife's involved.
Yeah, Harriet
Correct.
McDougal.
And so eventually, after a few trial and error, they settled on Brandon Sanderson to take over the Wheel of Time series to finish the series, which was a few books. So that directly links Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson together in that progression over a few decades of books. And so that takes, a recently passed away semi-contemporary author and links it to an immediately contemporary author. I believe Brandon Sanderson's a professor at BYU.
Yes.
Still doing that, yeah, in writing all of that. My youngest son actually.
Oh, nice.
Software development. Oh, and that's where his energy's going right now, but because that makes a lot more money. but
Yeah,
he is a writer, and he got to meet Brandon Sanderson here at Spokane a few times and talk to him. He was like 11 or something at the time. But he's very accessible. He's very shy, very, very quiet, shy a person, even though he's a professor, has to speak in front of him. He can do it, but he has to stretch for it. But yeah, so that would be a great way to start that, kind of tie all of those together. And then, of course, his comments about Tolkien as well. That's a great.
my son-in-law is a writer and college student. He's an aspiring writer in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi. He knows quite a bit about Brandon Sanderson, so I'm just sending him an invite.
Yeah, I should see if I get Drake in on it.
That'd be great.
He's a huge...
And we can always do a two-parter if we had to.
Yeah.
Live. Okay, one moment. All right. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for those of you who are here. So, like I said, does that sound like a good proposal? Could we, and each of us could suggest a different. We could take turns.
Yay.
Yay! How many
Any
nays?
nays?
Any nays?
How do you feel about it?
Abstentions?
Yeah, I'm abstaining because I'm basically have read Tolkien and haven't read any of these other guys. But so go ahead.
Do you, Gary? Let me ask this. Would you say that there are other fantasy authors that you also respect or enjoy, or would you say that really there's only Tolkien for you as far as fantasy?
Tolkien is about the only one because usually my interests lie in nonfiction and stuff like that, and just the way my life has developed.
That's fine.
Interests. And I basically, there's lots of periods where I haven't had any time to read.
Understood.
Yeah.
That's just
Right,
fine.
right now, if we retire early enough, I'll stay up and read Lord of the Rings for the fourth or fifth time. It takes a
Sure.
while to get through that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I'm not familiar. I remember some of the old people or some of the new people. Yeah, we're a lot of us are getting up there now. But
The elder race.
people, yeah, and you guys are accepted.
we're the younger children of Iluvatar.
Yes.
Yeah, you are.
Men.
But they talk about other authors, who were prominent before the 60s. What was it? Casey was one of them or something like that.
Uh-huh.
I'd hear the names I have a hard time remembering. But
Yeah.
some of them were fairly strange too. So
Oh yes. Yeah, there's plenty of that too.
yeah.
Yeah, the fantastical, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's been my life story because I've spent most of my life overseas, in the Air Force and over after the Air Force as a civilian, and really enjoyed it. But I was doing bigger things.
Well, Gary, that we're so glad that you're here, and you certainly don't have to have read widely of fantasy authors because there's so many different readers, and each of us has our own particular interests, and Hawk knows so much about sci-fi that I don't know. Babylon 5.
See, I don't know that much sci-fi actually.
Okay.
I do like video sci-fi, but sci-fi books I never really enjoyed.
Really?
Except for very few,
I'm a
like
sci-fi
Dune and a little
Pern?
bit. What's that?
Pern, the Dragon.
Well, I
Riders?
consider that fantasy rather than sci-fi. I mean, it's a bridge.
It's a hybrid. Yeah.
If it's got a more fantasy element, then I'm
Yeah,
more open.
true that.
If it had magic, I enjoyed it.
Star Wars?
If it was pure, I didn't enjoy the books.
Really?
Yeah, I love the movies. Yes, the first movie. I mean, I was in California in 1977 when it came out and saw it.
So
there.
jealous.
And then I moved to Utah in 77 before it was in Utah, and it was coming, and I was in line, and it wasn't a very long line
Really?
to see it. And when it arrived in Utah, and then I saw it like 13 times in its first run when I was a kid. So yeah, I like the movies,
If
the
I could
visual
turn
media
back
sci-fi I love.
Yes.
I'm not really that much into the sci-fi book. Most of the sci-fi writers I just really haven't enjoyed. Exceptions of Asimov and Frank Herbert, things like that.
Highline. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few, but
Yeah.
they're more the epic.
Golden age of sci-fi.
Yeah, and Piers Anthony was the only one I read some because the gateway was Xanth.
Yeah.
But then I read also his sci-fi stuff, and then his Incarnations Immortality books, which were kind of an in-between.
Yeah, he really experimented a lot.
So, and that was his better writing, I think. His other stuff was all fluff pulp stuff. But anyway,
very much so.
Great can't make it today, but he will try to plan for next month.
Then let's definitely start this ball rolling.
Yeah.
And then we can kind of add some more
Because
comments.
he was a big Robert Jordan fan and a big Brandon Sanderson fan.
Great.
And he met Brandon Sanderson.
See, I already feel like there's
And
some
went to the
positive energy
workshops,
here where we
etc.
can be like, because I think things are really interesting when you put them next
all
to
that
each other.
context. too.
That's right. Yeah.
So yeah. That's,
Okay. Thank you, Hawk.
You bet.
Yeah,
I'm
thanks.
going to.
Okay. Then I'm going to swing around.
You
That way I can face. Both.
You're
Gary-
right-handed, right?
I am left-handed.
Oh, you are left-handed. Oh, great.
Oh.
That's what I prefer.
Really?
Yeah. I remember I was born left, raised right.
Oh
I was the opposite, born right, raised left.
Really? That's
No.
unusual.
Well, actually, I use my right
So
hand
you weren't
most.
born sinister, but your parents wanted to make you sinister?
Oh,
They
my,
should have named him Dexter.
no, my dad wanted to make me a southpaw because he wanted me to be like a professional baseball player. So.
Oh.
Interesting.
Advantage.
Wow.
Yeah.
Merchandise.
Huh.
Alas, it was not to be.
Yeah.
Oh.
My dad was left-handed. I was born left-handed.
Yeah.
And my mom thought that would make life too difficult because back in the 70s,
Right.
accommodated righties. Lefties, I
Left-handed,
mean.
left-handed scissors, for example. Horrible.
Doors, scissors, school, everything
Well, Paul McCartney
was hard. So she tried really hard to raise my right-handed son semi-dexterous. Not ambidextrous and semi-dexterous.
Semi.
Yeah, I'd
So
probably
some
say
things
the same thing.
that I learned on my own, I do better left-handed.
See, even the word ambidextrous or semi-dextrous is what would you call handist?
Ambiguous?
It's handist.
Handist.
because it's,
Automatically assumed right,
yes, dexterous, which refers to the right hand.
as opposed
Yeah.
to sinister.
That's right.
Sinister.
As it should.
Oh, the real war breaks out on Tolkien scholars, right? Yeah, yeah. Well, all handed people are welcome
Yeah.
here at the Ea Tolkien Society.
yes.
So hail and well met.
Hands, paws, claws, they're all welcome.
Yes. And
All right,
there's a
have
few
fun,
rangers.
everybody.
Okay, thank you, Hawk. There's a few rangers who are dour handed as well.
Oh, what's
With-
that mean?
Dour hand. I think it means to be
Dur.
dur-handed. Bitter with their use of the sword.
Yes.
Yes.
Dwarves
Oh,
as
okay.
well.
Yes, indeed. Okay, well, okay, so let's do this then. If everyone's in agreement with this, we'll start with talking a little bit about Brandon Sanderson, and I want to give credit here to my daughter and son-in-law for really getting me into Brandon Sanderson. Of course, he, as an author, was writing from the early part of well, I should say this century, right? I would
Yeah.
classify Sanderson as a 21st century author.
Yeah.
And his first novel, Elantris, was actually published. Well, this says 2005,
Yes.
so that's the first edition.
Yes.
And then has really grown immensely popular for his Mistborn series, which is actually the first book I read.
Yeah.
Which was Mistborn. It was. Did you enjoy it?
Yeah. Well, I haven't finished it yet, but I think it's really good so far.
Okay. So Mistborn is really very good. He's got a very interesting kind of magic system. He has a whole kind of theory. He's talked before at cons or conventions about hard magic versus soft magic. And the idea there is that with a fantasy author, right, they may have to decide, okay, well, in the world that I'm creating, is the magic in there more imbued in the creation itself, like the elves, for example. So he would kind of classify Tolkien as being more of a fantasy author, in which there's soft magic, and so his fantasy writing is more hard magic in the sense that there's technique to it. Although I think that needs to be distinguished from something so it's not like Harry Potter, which has this kind of sense of maybe some kind of resonance with the modern world or kind of a parallel world or something like that. Mistborn truly is otherworldly, but it's fascinating because some people are born with certain talents, but these talents can be enhanced by drinking a compound or no, a solution
Yeah.
with a metal in it, correct?
Yes.
And that's called burning that metal. And so it depends on. So some people, it's you burn tin, or what would be some of the other ones?
Was there copper?
Copper. So some of these different kinds of metals, and the idea that they're deeply part of that world, and so there's this rare kind of gift or ability that allows you to do certain kinds of magical things. It is very interesting, I have to say. And there's several more books in that series, but this is Elantris, and this is Brandon Sanderson's first novel. And so this was recommended to me as well. And so I thought, well, I'll go back and read his first novel and see if it's any good. And I was really pleasantly surprised. This is his fantasy debut, and it's worth reading also.
He's
So
a good
that's-
writer.
He's a good writer. He really is. And that's why I respect him.
Have you read the Stormlight Archive yet?
The Stormlight Archive, I have not.
Okay, I've read a little bit of The Way of Kings.
Oh, okay. Way of Kings. I've heard that's really good.
It is.
So I'd like to read more of his writing. It's worthwhile. I would recommend him to anyone. But I want to actually read something and ask for discussion on it. About, because again, the concept here is that every month for the Ea Tolkien Society, we are going to take an author and compare and contrast this author with j.r.r. Tolkien. Not necessarily to say, which is better, but thinking a little bit more nuanced. There's really three groups of writers, right? We can compare Tolkien to those authors that came before him who contributed to the rise of fantasy literature. We can compare Tolkien with his contemporaries, and many people do, like the Inklings, such as C.S. Lewis and other authors, William Morris perhaps, and a few others. And then we can also compare him with more current, or since the 40s and 50s and 60s, when Tolkien was publishing these works. And of course that has continued on through Tolkien's son, Christopher. But really, we would locate him right kind of in the middle of the 20th century. So looking at later authors who were perhaps influenced by j.r.r. Tolkien. So I'd like to just kind of share this quote. This is by Brandon Sanderson, and here's what he says. This is the FAQ page from his website, brandonsanderson.com. And so this is not too long. I'm just going to read this. It says, "Why don't you use the classic races like elves and orcs and so on?" Answer: for a long time, I've felt that epic fantasy has relied too much on Tolkien, who did a wonderful job. But I feel that rather than doing what he did by creating races and mythologies and worlds of our own, we've in some ways allowed ourselves to be strongly influenced by him and relied on some of the work he did. In other cases, those tropes have just been overplayed and overdone by people who were very good writers and knew what they were doing. I certainly don't want to point any fingers at people like Stephen Donaldson. I know, he just put it his finger. Who wrote brilliant books making use of some of the familiar tropes from Tolkien. But one of the things to remember is that when he did that, they weren't familiar tropes. They were still fresh and new. The same can be said for Terry Brooks. If you've read anything by Terry Brooks.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, that's somebody I'm familiar with. I heard of the author anyway.
Right, the Shannara series.
Yeah, exactly.
Or also Magic Kingdom for Sale Sold, which is kind of a whimsical fantasy novel. The same can be said for Terry Brooks. I'm sure if I were writing back then, that's what I would have done too, because we were still exploring the genre and trying to decide where it was going to go and what epic fantasy was and meant. But I feel that I belong to the generation after that. There was the generation who relied a lot on Tolkien and the generation who grew up reading those authors' books. And a lot of us in my generation of writers seem like we are reacting against the previous generations by saying, okay, that's been done, and you did a good job. Where else can we take this? I have no interest in writing about elves or dwarves or any of these things that have been explored for the last 4 decades in intricate detail. I want to go my own directions. I feel that epic fantasy as a genre has not yet hit its golden age yet. If you look at science fiction as a genre, science fiction very quickly got into extrapolating very interesting and different sorts of things. Fantasy, particularly in the late 90s, feels like it hit a bit of a rut, where the same old things were happening again and again. We saw the same stories being told, we saw the same races show up, we saw variations only in the names for those races. For me as a reader, it was a little bit frustrating because I read this and felt that fantasy should be the genre that should be able to do anything. It should be the most imaginative genre. It should not be the genre where you expect the same stories and the same creatures. If we want to approach the heights of great storytelling and take it a few more steps so that we don't just copy what Tolkien did, we do what Tolkien did, which is to look to the lore ourselves and build our own extrapolations. This is playing into what I like as a reader and my own personal philosophies and hobby horses, but it really just comes down to what I think makes the best story. So there is Brandon Sanderson's perspective, and I just wanted to say, let's throw this up in for discussion. Gary, did you have any thoughts on that?
Okay. I can see his point of view. I agree with it. One thing you said, hard magic versus soft magic. I think I understand where you're going. At times in Tolkien, there wasn't a lot of magic. There was only a few people who could really practice it. Everybody else kind of, follow the laws of physics. But hard magic, I would guess, is like Harry Potter and waving a wand and saying the right words, and all of a sudden, you change, some kid you don't like at Hogwarts into a goose or something like that. But anyway, this guy has I think, a valid perspective on that. And he wanted to strike out on his own and not be just a copycat Tolkien, because, I mean, I think it's very hard to be better at Tolkien, than his craft if you're trying to emulate him. And I think he, he's got a valid point there. And it just remains to be seen if he's as, and I've never read it, so I don't know, but if he's as good as he thinks he is, or whether he's succeeded or not.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. What about you, Anthony?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the broad outlines of what Brandon Sanderson said. I think what surprised me the most was when he said that we have not yet reached the golden age of fantasy, and that's what it took me back a bit, because like, wasn't the golden age just Tolkien and C.S. Lewis? But I can kind of see what he's saying, because Tolkien was really the progenitor of modern fantasy, because other authors before him kind of didn't. They wrote fantasy, but it wasn't like this own kind of self-contained world, or secondary world, as he would call it. And
right, they were exploring this idea of fairy, weren't they?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so those are the roots, but it's not the trunk of the tree, as it were, right?
Yeah, and it seems like earlier fantasy, especially if you go back to like the Middle Ages, was kind of indistinguishable from like mythology.
True.
But I think that I could definitely see why he would want to Brandon Sanderson would want to take a new approach to fantasy, just because, as much as I love Tolkien-esque fantasy, which is fantasy inspired by Tolkien, I do feel that it's kind of been overdone now, and tried and true, and it works. It has worked well for the past couple decades, but now I'm really ready. I think fantasy fans are really ready to embrace something new. And
it does raise some interesting questions, and I think one of the questions that it raises is kind of, again, what part does Tolkien play in the rise of the fantasy genre? What is the golden age? It kind of also gets at the fact that maybe this also liberates us from having to necessarily when I talk to people who are maybe more skeptical about Tolkien, because maybe his writing style is older. It does feel to people who don't have that background knowledge, it is harder for them to get through. So I feel like what I can say to them is, look, you need to admire and enjoy Tolkien as a writer for what he did, but you can't duplicate that, right? I mean, you can't. So I think there's an interesting question, is like, what does it mean to emulate? And is that the same as being inspired by? Let me just share you an example. So Terry Brooks is another one that we can explore at some point in the future, but he definitely would belong to what Sanderson is saying. Looking backwards now, there's this generation of writers after Tolkien. And Gary, your perspective is really interesting, because I know that you shared at one point how you began reading Lord of the Rings, I think, while Tolkien was still alive. This is pre-1973, correct?
Yes. I was in the Air Force, and it was close to the day of his death, but I think it was in the early 70s I started reading.
Right.
I read The Hobbit at the University of Wisconsin in my non-distinguished year there. And anyway, I just loved the book, and then I picked up paperback copies of Lord of the Rings, I don't know, at Exchange bookstore. I don't remember even if they came together as a set, all three books, or if I picked up one at a time. But yeah, it was then I was hooked.
Right.
And when I started, I didn't know Tolkien from anything. So.
Well, and that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Is that there were these writers beforehand, right? Like Lord Dunsany, or other writers from the earlier 20th century or late 19th century, such as George MacDonald, for example. But what Tolkien seems to have done is to popularize. Like, he wrote a story that, for whatever reason, whether it was because of the story itself or because of the time in which he lived and the events going on in the world, but it reached people. It reached, you in the Air Force, and it reached a broad section of society, and it was translated into their languages. So this is something that had not really happened to the same extent before.
It's interesting what you're saying, because at the time, as I remember, it was kind of cutting edge.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody had seen it. The people I got turned on to Tolkien by were kind of very unique people, morticians' helpers.
That's interesting.
And they were, assisting the county coroner there.
Wow.
That's interesting.
And, yeah, they were quite interesting, that couple. But it was, I expanded that, and then, from time to time, I went back, I read Tolkien, but I never expanded my horizons beyond that. But I do know that Tolkien, I mean, what did he look to? He looked to what? Teutonic and Norse myths for a
That's
lot
right.
of his things.
Yep.
Beowulf played a
Yep.
part.
Yep.
And
The Eddas in
and I keep wondering where
Iceland.
Iceland came from, because that's a big province in Spain.
Aragorn.
Aragon, yeah. So, but whatever, that's just an aside. I mean,
Yes.
neither here nor there. But, when I think of something, you're standing on the shoulders of the people who came before you.
Right.
And is this guy still standing on Tolkien's shoulders, or is he trying to create, what is his name, Sanderson? Is he trying to create a whole new genre?
Well, I mean, I think that he's, I don't think he's saying that, sorry, I'm trying to just send this information on. I don't think that he's poo-pooing what Tolkien kind of did, but I think he's saying he was a pioneer, and so I think that he's kind of like saying, well, look, that doesn't mean we all need to live in log cabins, right? I mean, a pioneer accomplishes an important. They open up, a frontier for others, and so he's saying that you have Tolkien and his generation. I mean, to this certain extent, I love C.S. Lewis, but for very different reasons, and certainly Tolkien as a sub-creator, as an ability to create Middle Earth as a world. I don't feel like he ever has. I don't think that there's anything that has paralleled it to the same extent, and that's because of like what Hawk has mentioned before, and that is that he started with the languages, and he created the world around those languages, and very, very few fantasy authors that I know of have ever done that. Where
what other author had created his own languages?
Right.
That blows you away.
Sure. So we can still say he's like the grandfather or the father of epic fantasy literature, high fantasy.
Yeah.
And I think that's still honoring of him, but I think the question is that Sanderson is raising is, if we say that we must follow his example like a formula, Sanderson thinks that's a mistake. And so this is the interesting thing, is that he says there's two things that he recognizes that Tolkien has done, and this is where I would agree with him, even though I certainly love Tolkien's works more than Sanderson. But I think if we're just looking at the quality of what he's saying, he says here, on the one hand, so one of the things to remember is that when Tolkien was writing, he says what he was doing is he was trying to look to the lore, like you pointed out there, Gary, look to, say, the mythic foundation or infrastructure that's underground, that goes back to the deepest roots in the Western society or civilization, and be able to tap into these things that have been maybe forgotten, and build our own what ifs. What if there were a world in which these things were true? And I think that part I would definitely agree with, is because and then each work of fantasy then is judged according to, is it successful based on what it does it have that what did Tolkien say on, because I think one of Tolkien's greatest works is actually not even any of his fantasy literature. I think Tolkien's greatest contribution is his lengthy essay on fairy stories.
Oh,
Because what he does there is he kind of lays a roadmap. He says, look, what are fairy stories? They are this desire for us to seek out the wonder and the peril, which mythology and past times kind of reached for. And so he's saying that's important, and that's not just for children, right? Hey, Corey, come on in. Welcome.
hello.
Grab a chair. It's right over there. So I think, and I'm talking too long here, but I wanted to say that Brandon Sanderson, in saying that Tolkien was really good at what he did, he's saying we are not bound to kind of mimic him. So then what does it mean to emulate him? I mean, if emulate bigger than mimicking? Because if you mimic, like Terry Brooks, with the Shannara series, he starts to get creative later on, but the very first book, you feel like, oh, this is basically this guy trying to copy Middle Earth, and it feels second rate, because you're like, well, you can't do Middle Earth; it's already been done. So then, be different, do something new, and eventually Shannara did get pretty interesting, I think.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what we're talking about. Is just to catch you up, Corey. We're each month we've decided we're going to take an author, whether from before Tolkien or since Tolkien,
Right.
or maybe living at the same time, and just kind of compare and contrast, and look at like maybe what do they owe? Because I think Sanderson owes a lot to Tolkien, just like the branches owe a lot to the trunk.
Yeah, and I think some other authors too, like George R.R. Martin, are explicitly reacting against Tolkien because Martin, much as he admired Tolkien, he didn't emphasize much of hardcore raw realism of human nature
True.
and the political and social aspects.
Right. Or Philip Pullman, and authors like him.
Yeah, Philip Pullman was very reactive against that.
Very reactive.
Because he feels like the literature that Tolkien was writing somehow made the past greater than it should have been. Like everything happens in the past, everything was greater in the past, and that he was, this idea that Tolkien was taking the things out of the past and bringing them forward and making new things out of them. Philip Pullman didn't like that. He felt that was being focused too much on the things before, and like looking at it would be, I think it would be, the criticism would be why we Americans focus so much on being Greeks and Romans, because we have a tendency to focus on the idea, because we're from the Enlightenment period, that the Greeks and Romans were amazing people, and so we should emulate the Greeks and the Romans, and the Roman Empire was a great thing. So and that's the kind of thing that
Right.
Philip Pullman is saying.
Right.
I don't want to go that direction.
But
I don't like his.
But I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding, right? That's a misunderstanding of Tolkien, because I think Tolkien would say, I'm not saying that everything in the past was great. He's kind of, it's an alternate view, and that's interesting, right? Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, I was going to say, very up to your side. I don't think that the battle at Somme was great or anything like that.
Oh.
Which is where I think he got more of it. But
Right.
what I wanted to say in response to that is, I think to make literature, TV, movies, popular, which is what you want if you're an author, you're not doing it for free. You've got to be able to relate to what people understand.
Yeah.
And, the people he was writing for, I think, this is my opinion, anyway, with Tolkien, I mean, their lore was full of elves and dwarves and, goblins, that type of thing.
Right.
And Brothers Grimm and all this other good stuff. So, I don't know how you bridge that, how you strike out your own, like you said, Sanderson wants to do. And just, I don't know if it's a clean Clean Breaker wants to again
Right.
bring it forth and make it even richer.
What do you think, Anthony? Do you think that Sanderson is saying he wants to make a clean break or not?
I think he wants to make a total clean break. I think he considers Tolkien and his or Sanderson's predecessors like the foundation that are like kind of building, and so I think he considers Tolkien to be the foundation upon which we can build sort of a kind of a new sort of fantasy, one that kind of stretches the limits of the human imagination and kind of reaches new heights and new horizons of what's possible in fantasy literature, instead of just imitating past or paying homage to it. Um, because I think history and human society is still progressing, either forward or backward, but depending on your point of view. And I think maybe all literature, I think, is reflective of our culture, society, and our psyche.
Yeah. Well, what do you think, Corey? Have you read Sanderson?
I have, but not that book. I read.
What have you read?
He has this book about these human beings that are going around essentially assassinating superheroes. Not superheroes. They're actually anybody with a superpower somehow turns evil.
Mistborn?
No.
Was it
Steelheart.
Oh, okay.
Steelheart's the name of it. Anyways, I don't know. I have a really hard time because Sanderson essentially said that if you had superpowers that you automatically were evil and needed to be killed off, which I don't know. That seems a bit of a jump there, in my opinion. It's kind of like they're saying that there is nobody out there who has power that can be good at the same time. That's the problem I have. A lot of people say absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. Well,
yeah.
The thing is, as Christians, if you are a believing Christian, you believe that Jesus Christ was God, and what that means is that he had a lot of power and he didn't use it to, drop fire bombs from space or,
Right.
or cause lightning strikes to kill people and stuff like that.
But it's interesting because you say that because did you ever see on the Sci-Fi Channel the TV series Haven?
No.
There was a conflict within the town between. I mean, this was a town that gave sanctuary to all these people with strange powers. And most of them were not good. I mean, they were not bad people, but their powers, when they were activated,
Destructive, huh?
caused big problems and,
Right.
for everybody all around. And there was a contingent in that town that thought that their job should be to eradicate people.
Wow.
It takes place in Maine. It's escapist entertainment. So it's good to approach it without too much of a critical mind. Anyway, when you said that, Corey, I was thinking of that particular TV series because I'm not well read with other fantasy writers.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, Sanderson, I don't know. I like superheroes. I grew up on superheroes. And the problem is I just couldn't swallow what Sanderson had at the end of the book. It pretty much, he said, that everybody that had superpowers were pretty much evil.
I think kind of a... What if a fantasy author, though, is not necessarily trying to make an argument? I mean, they are saying something, but I guess this idea of extrapolations he mentions. I'm going to read part of this again just because you missed it.
I know.
It's okay, but I think it is relevant to what we're trying to say or talk about here. Is that okay if I just read part of this again?
Yeah.
Okay, so Sanderson's it's on his FAQ page on his website, and he says, why don't you use the classic races like elves and orcs and so on? So he says, for a long time I've felt that epic fantasy has relied too much on Tolkien, who did a wonderful job, but I feel that rather than doing what he did by creating races and mythologies and worlds of our own, we've in some ways allowed ourselves to be strongly influenced by him and relied on some of the work he did. In other cases, those tropes have been overplayed and overdone by people who were very good writers and knew what they were doing. And I'm going to skip down to where he talks about this idea of extrapolation. He says, he describes the generation after Tolkien as relying a lot on Tolkien. And a lot of us in my generation of writers seem like we are reacting against the previous generations by saying, okay, that's been done and you did a good job. Where else can we take this? I have no interest in writing about elves or dwarves or any of those things that have been explored the last 4 decades in intricate detail. I want to go my own directions. And he says, I feel that epic fantasy as a genre has not yet hit its golden age. And then he says, if you look at science fiction as a genre, science fiction very quickly got into extrapolating very interesting and different sorts of things. Fantasy, particularly in the late 90s, feels like it hit a bit of a rut where the same old things were happening again and again. We only saw variations in the names for those races. For me as a reader, it was a little bit frustrating because I read this and felt that fantasy should be the genre. So this is one of his concepts. Fantasy should be the genre that should be able to do anything. It should be the most imaginative genre. It should not be the genre where you expect the same stories and the same creatures. If we want to approach the heights of great storytelling and take it a few more steps so that we don't just copy what Tolkien did, we will do what Tolkien did, which is to look to the lore ourselves and build our own extrapolations. So I think that's his, if anything, that's his argument. I think what he would say maybe about the Steelheart is, this is just one extrapolation, might not be a great one. In Lantris, that's not the same thing he's saying.
Well, right.
So
I don't...
guess what we need to do is we need to not judge an author by just one book, but say, in this book, he's exploring this idea and that. It's kind of shabby, right?
I just feel that Sanderson, he was tasked with the impossible thing of finishing off the Wheel of Time series, which I feel bad for the guy because, how do you deal with a, 15 book saga or whatever, and you have to finish it off? I'm just saying that I agree with what Sanderson is saying, because I do think in the article, because I do think that sometimes we rely too much on Tolkien. See, Tolkien in his day was a novelty. Like, nobody talked about myth the way Tolkien did, because Tolkien was so deep into mythology and the words that it was different.
Right, and nobody else was doing it because they didn't take it seriously.
Nobody else wanted to take it seriously.
Or Beowulf, for that matter. That Beowulf was kind of considered, on the rubbish heap almost.
Yeah, but that was his life's work. Right?
All I'm trying to say is that Tolkien was, he broke away from the pack, so to say.
Yeah.
And we've had this discussion before, is that because he was a little bit odd, it also helped him blaze a trail that nobody else had blazed.
Right.
And the thing is that I think what happens is a lot of people nowadays, they like the environment that is a cleaner Middle Earth than our Earth that's covered in noxious fumes and all this pollution, and there's also some simplicity to the idea of building, you can build your own set of arrows out of something you found on the farm, or whatever. I'm just saying that's what Tolkien points out, I think, in one of his what's that essay, is it Tree and Leaf, Tree and Leaf, or whatever. Anyways, so the point I think that's interesting is that I do feel that the genre of fantasy has kind of gotten stuck in a rut because we haven't produced anything very
unique.
Something that would capture the attention of all the hearts of people.
Yeah, because he says sci-fi does that. He said sci-fi starts with your Russian and American and British, I don't know who else, sci-fi writers in the 30s and kind of post World War I, and then it really comes into its own in the 40s and 50s with Asimov and
I think that's
that generation, and then it really goes all over the place, and it doesn't just kind of copy. What I mean?
Well, as the thing about most science fiction is it deals with physics, saying that the physics that we have discovered is not all that's happened, and that there's some physics out there that allow us to do things like go through time because we have wormholes or whatever. time machines. We have, I mean, the idea is that, Tolkien used to joke, or was it Chesterton who used to joke about the science fiction novels were about engineers who were on some adventure in some, fixing some ship that was floating along essentially in space out there, and it was the engineer's dream or something along those lines. The idea that physics becomes almost metaphysical, like it almost overlaps, and a lot of people would like it that physics and metaphysics would just stay in their corners and not talk to one another. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not.
That's an interesting question, Corey, because I wonder if we look at sci-fi and Brandon Sanderson saying, well, sci-fi developed and diverged into all these different extrapolations of what if this and what if that, and very rich. But there are tropes in science fiction.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like nowadays it's got to be a pretty amazing story to make time travel look good to me, because I'm so
everybody's
sick.
done it.
I'm so sick. I watched The Flash for like a season on TV a couple years ago, and I'm just like, are you kidding me? This is just becoming. It started out really interesting, and then I'm like, you keep going back and saying, well, actually, everything you knew is different, and it gets a little old.
Yeah.
Same thing with Marvel.
Yeah.
Plus, in science fiction, I feel like there's no single author like there is in fantasy with Tolkien, to which like contemporary sci-fi writers look back and say, "Oh, this guy was like the foundation." But
Well,
I
yeah.
mean, there were a couple like Isaac Asimov who was a Tolkien fan, by the way.
Who was the famous one who said that science that's sufficiently advanced is equivalent to magic? I mean,
Arthur C. Clarke.
Yeah, Arthur C. Clarke. I mean, that's been around forever, and that's a theme that gets thrown out in science fiction all the time.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that...
Which is itself a bias, I think.
Yeah, which itself is a bias, but that's, it's interesting. It's interesting because he's saying that sci-fi has a wider range. Maybe the reason why there's a wider range is because they don't have anything to mimic in the same way that we do with Tolkien.
Yeah.
Tolkien's there, and we enjoyed it, but we don't really know how to put our finger on what it is about Tolkien that made it so enjoyable for us the first time we went through it.
Are there any comments from the live chat, Anthony, that anybody who's
No, I don't see any.
Gary, did you have anything you wanted to say
Well,
there?
I was just, one thing I thought was interesting that, the sci-fi thing, the one thing you said had been overdone, I agree, because I see it in TV shows all the time, is, changing or jumping through time all the time. I mean, I forget, we got rid of cable, now we're streaming, so I get all those. And I wonder, is it succeeding? Can they get beyond that? But, the thing about time travel is, Stephen Hawking was asked once, is time travel, do you think that would be possible? And he says no, because otherwise we'd be overrun by tourists in the future.
Yeah.
That is a great quote. I love that quote.
Yeah.
And, it's still, I mean, there's still an element of fantasy and
Yeah, that's a great point there, Gary.
in sci-fi. But who's the father of sci-fi? Would it be Jules Verne?
Yeah. Actually, yeah.
Yeah.
H.G. Wells.
Well, H.G. Wells had put it in the time machine. Whoever thought of a time machine until H.G. Wells?
Yeah. I mean, I always go ahead.
I mean, some of Jules Verne's things came about, the submarine.
Yeah, 20,000.
They had, even in the Revolutionary War,
Right.
in the American Revolutionary War, they had a submarine that didn't work very well, and the Confederates tried it, but Jules Verne, had the knowledge. So,
Well, ever since the idea...
it's interesting because sometimes, it's pulled to what we're doing these days, but not all the time. I mean, I thought, based on what they had in the Seattle World's Fair, which was how many years ago, we'd be all in flying cars by now. It'd be the Jetsons.
We're Back to the Future.
Yeah,
The
DeLorean.
hoverboards. Yeah.
So, but yeah, it has science fiction reached its full potential? I don't know. Has fantasy, I mean, Sanderson thinks nowhere has reached its, like he says, his golden age. Maybe there's more. We'll see. But has Sanderson reached it? That's my question, because I'm not familiar with the guy.
Yeah, well, we have a month that you can maybe consider looking into it a little bit if you want. But Corey, did you have a comment on there?
All I was going to say was that science fiction is about dreams about the future most of the time, about what's possible,
What could be.
And a lot of physicists deal with what they call the multi-universe theory. It's the idea that there's a multiple timelines that are all somehow branching outward from all these decisions that we make.
Yeah.
It's a huge deal, and it influences a lot of our science fiction nowadays, because time travel stuff can't deal with logically with it without having a multiple universe theory kind of thing going on. And so that I guess what they're doing is they're taking physics and they're stretching it out into kind of something bigger and whatever. But the harder thing is the more technologically advanced we become, the harder and harder it is to really dream about a possibility where somebody can teleport. I mean, teleporting becomes, it's what's the possibility of teleporting? What's the possibility of wormholes? All these things. The problem is,
what about a communicator?
Yeah. Communicator.
Scotty beam us up.
Digital.
Yeah, I mean, my first one was a flip phone, which looked a lot like the Star Trek communicator.
Yeah, me too. Mine too.
Yeah.
I mean, those dreams do push us though into innovation, but sometimes I think things are just out, like time travel is probably outside of normal physics, but we daydream about the impossible all the time. We want something unusual, something strange. I think that's kind of something that Tolkien talks about.
I guess one of the things I'd like to pull us back to is this thought in which how is epic fantasy different in what it asks, because like you said, Corey, so science fiction kind of deals with what could be, right? And fantasy is dealing much more with what could never be. And I feel that there is something. I was looking up this morning. I was doing a little research on the movie Lady Hawk with Rutger Hauer from 1980s, and it was really interesting because here it's a medieval story, or at least it is when you look at the face of it, but it's got like these magical elements that are in it. I think a lot of epic fantasy uses a familiar setting, a setting that's far enough in the past that it feels strange yet familiar. And I think that's really interesting because there's a reason for that. I think you can have your kind of steampunk, kind of Victorian period of time, but I don't think that it's back far enough. We need to get back far enough in the mists of time that it's like, well, here's heroes and here's monsters, etc. So it can be changed and made wondrous. And I mean, there's something to that. The fairy. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of fantasy too, particularly since Tolkien is a little bit too beholden to like the medieval setting. Because whenever some of us think of fantasy, we think like medieval fantasy, right?
Yeah.
Well, why can't there be fantasy based partly on like historical ancient Rome or Greece or Egypt or the prehistoric past even? So I think Sanderson is right to point out that I feel like we've bound ourselves too much to this formula, and we haven't really broken away from that primary influence of that medieval.
So
That's very typical.
right. I know, but I guess the question I would wrestle with then is to say, can it still be fantasy that touches the heart, and be based on those times? And I think it could.
Yeah, if you have the right characters,
story. I think one of the things that I love about fantasy, and specifically about Tolkien, is the verisimilitude, the sense in which, though it seems so different, right, as the medieval period does, it fascinates us, and yet it's so different from our modern convenience-oriented lifestyle. We somebody mentioned simpler. I think part of it is this ache in our time. Why did Tolkien explode on the scene? Why was his audience so ready for it? Because people were longing, I think, for a simpler time. So the needs of people change over, in terms of what they're really hungry for.
Well, see, the hard part is, I've read people who talk about how to write fiction, especially fantasy fiction, and one of the things that they have a tendency to do is they always get caught up in all this medieval, like, practical stuff that Tolkien never did. Like, I don't know how to explain that,
Like
but when you go to Bjorn,
system.
well,
Yeah.
no, a monetary
Or
system, for example.
tax structure.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
j.r.r. Martin talked about.
Right. Well, I think we're not interested in tax structure. I'm not saying that can't be a part of our story, but I think.
We're certainly not able to escape from the real world.
But what is
Yeah.
the dream? What is the dream? What is the mythology?
Yeah.
What is it that's motivating us for the past? To be honest, fantasy is not just about the past. It's about how great the past was, or how great things were before they fell.
Yeah.
That's what Tolkien was always talking about, was this
Like a mythic past.
like
An
this
imaginary past.
degenerative slide,
Right.
and the past was greater, and that's the reason why Philip Pullman doesn't like Tolkien.
That has been probably the most, I guess, single most used plot in any literature is the past was idyllic, and what we've done, I mean,
It's Eden. It's kind of
it's
the out of
it's
Eden.
created a whole new way of thinking.
Right.
Look at Rousseau, Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher, and what he said, everywhere man is born free, but he lives in chains or something like that. And, the Parsifal and all, the original Eden and the fall, and then the, what would you call it?
Well, the journey of redemption is.
Yeah, redemption and stuff like that. That is a basic plot line, is what I'm trying to say.
Sure. Well, and those things do deeply move us because you look in the Middle Ages, they had the everyman stories, and plays and whatnot, and I mean, the whole reason why any kind of literature grabs us. I mean, I love Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities, because for whatever reason, I mean, I've not read much of anything else that Dickens wrote, but that time period really grabs me, because you're in a crisis, the French Revolution, and so it seems like some authors like Sanderson also write where there's this civilizational crisis. Mistborn is kind of like that, where you have this emperor who's again evil.
Yeah.
And so how can we? But that's kind of like Star Wars, where you have an evil empire and you have rebels who are trying against desperate odds, and there's something really, and you could have that in ancient Greece, or you could have it somewhere else. But I think, and really Corey is kind of pointed me to Chesterton more than anybody has for a long time. And I think having lived in England for 4 years, I just was fascinated. And again, I think you're right. It doesn't have to be medieval, because the real Middle Ages, let's just be frank, was not so wonderful, right?
No.
Well, yeah, it's just like I don't remember what the TV show was, but this guy was talking to this woman. The woman gets up on the table and pees in this guy's face, and I'm like, whoa, that's crazy.
Okay.
Yeah.
No,
No, it was about a.
Keep this.
I am. But it was about a guy who was building. He was a builder for the Catholics, and he was building this huge church or whatever. And they were very good at getting all the perfect historical references correctly, but the story was not, in my opinion, very enjoyable.
Well, we could say it another way by saying along the same lines that castles were drafty, or if you got infections, you basically died.
Yeah.
But I don't, again, going back to Pullman's comments that you were paraphrasing, I don't think that Tolkien, right, let's say something like The Fall of Gondolin, one of the books that Christopher Tolkien published recently, which really is just putting together all of his father's, works on that one of the he called the three great stories.
Yeah.
Right. That he, which
Great
were
Tales.
the great tales, which would be the fall of Gondolin.
Baron, Children of Who.
There you go, Beren and Luthien, and then I don't have Children of Hurin here, but Hawk does somewhere on the shelf. But
He has everything on the shelf.
yes, so I guess I'm just trying to say here is that, when you look at the fall of Gondolin, he's not saying all past is idyllic. He's saying in order for us to be able to see life with new eyes, which is what he kind of, if you read the essay on fairy stories, which is I was saying is I think the best thing that Tolkien ever wrote, simply because he's contributing something here to the human conversation that's never been quite said that way. And so what you have in Gondolin here is you have a story, one of these three great tales he writes, which is unique. Okay, other people could write unique stories, but it's dealing with fantasy in such a way that it makes you long for something. It's that dream. It's this longing. C.S. Lewis called it Sehnsucht, this something otherworldly. And in sci-fi, that would be like, oh, it's just the world beyond, where no one has gone before. But in fantasy, it's exploring and saying, if only we could get back to something, and so it's okay that it's idealized, but it's helping us to come back to our own time, and no matter what is going on that's horrible, and that's that. I think I would react a little bit against it and say, yes, let's not idealize the past, let's be realistic, but this is not meant to be, a historical treatise on hidden valleys and castles that people build there as fortresses to hide from society. And that's where let's see what we can pull from Tolkien. Let's see what we can pull from others, which helps us to, for a time, forget the world in which we live, and then come back to this world more brave.
But Tolkien was very clear in his essay. He said that that mythology is one of the hardest to learn, the hardest areas to write in because of its spectacular requirements. I don't understand how he puts it exactly, but he's talking about the difference between escapism and desertion. Yes. He believes that literature should give us an escapist idea, but not a desertion of the world. And the idea is that these things that happen in Tolkien's books were supposed to take and make reality more solid to us than it was before we read the book.
Yes.
It was not meant to just leave us in, a pie in the sky kind of, cloud, kind of, misty.
Yes.
Kind of.
Didn't he do that? Because medieval times were actually, as Tolkien wrote and truthfully, were something that we're not familiar with. However, the thing we're familiar with, and I thought he was true to that, was human behavior.
Yeah.
With jealousy, sacrifice, all of that stuff, greed, and you see all that. That's kind of how we relate to that, because we can see, what we look at as good and what we look at as evil.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think to me, epic fantasy cannot be called epic fantasy unless we get a real closer look at that in some other setting, but that also in when you see the greed and the jealousy and the power struggle, there is this transcendent kind of looking to beyond the petty squabbles to something greater, and I think that's really important, because if it's just say, and I don't want to be critical of Game of Thrones completely here, because I haven't read it, haven't watched it, so I don't really want to, but if you take, say, a story that is about the greed, the jealousy, the the violence that people do to each other, and you just put it in a different time setting and whatnot. To me, that's not really fantasy. I mean, it could be, I guess, fantasy of a sort, but to me, yes, this cosmic battle between good and evil, in which there's lots of pawns moving, as it were.
You mean you don't care about the backstabbing politicians that are in the?
No, we've got enough of those. We've got enough of those now.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, I'm completely with you. I actually feel that J.R.R. Martin has very tenuous connections with fantasy, because I read through his stuff, and it's more about essentially the big guys getting bigger and destroying the other big guys. And
Yeah, it's ruthless.
it's ruthless. I mean, it's hard to.
But it's called
read.
fantasy because it's medieval, and that's
Yeah.
that's the thing you were getting
And I
at
think
before.
it-
This trope,
Yeah,
like
his
you know-
work, I think, was also really more to historical fiction. Like,
Oh.
Yeah.
you guys ever heard of Maurice Drouin's Cursed Kings series?
No.
No.
That, yeah, that's a great series of books. I've read the first 3 on French Capetian dynasty of the
Yeah,
Middle
sure.
Ages.
It's called
And-
what? The Accursed Kings?
The Accursed Kings, yes.
By what's the author?
Maurice Drouin, spelled Druon.
Okay.
But yeah, I would recommend it because it's if you like history, of course.
Mhm.
But it can get a little bit graphic at times. But yeah, I guess going back to what you were saying too, I think that within Tolkien's work and other great fantasy works, we can kind of look for pearls of wisdom with which to like live our lives, because as much as fantasy could be like a mere escapism, which is something that a lot of critics use as like a pejorative. Tolkien, I think it would see looked at escapism in a positive sense is sort of like breaking out of a prison.
Yes.
And exploring the possibilities of our minds and the imaginations, and
Mhm.
I think Tolkien was really looking on more, as much as there was a lot of evil in Tolkien's works.
Yeah.
He was also, I think, emphasizing that there is good.
It's
But you have to
Sam-
give context
it's
for evil.
It's Sam and Frodo on their way to Mordor, and there's that conversation, right?
Yeah.
Where it's about how the little people in the stories, and it's kind of about how we perceive legends. It's this wonderful conversation because here he's writing this dialogue for these imaginary characters who are discussing, will they even know about us, right? Because we're just ordinary people,
Yeah, little
little guys,
guys.
and so there's this wonderful thing there, I think, where it is meant to take us above, because we need that. We need to be able to come back and see things with fresh eyes.
Well, I feel like it's just a hard topic to talk about, because what defines the fantasy genre nowadays is probably nothing not lined up with Tolkien for the most part, because the problem is the way Tolkien saw language and so on and so forth, and people who are coming along, they're like, well, we need a guy who's living out in the woods and he can shoot a really good arrow. The elves taught him how to shoot really well. He's going to kill this demon thing, like a D&D, game, where that's the whole point of the book, is the collection of the 4 people who get together and they travel to the evil lands, and we got to kill.
One's the
One's a tank, one's an arrow. Yeah. And then they get there, and the magician is, the sorcerer is fighting.
spellcaster.
Yeah, the spellcaster is fighting the dragon, or whatever you want to call it, the demon, and all of a sudden they defeat the demon, and
Get a bunch of loot.
they get a bunch of loot, and they go back home, and it's serious. I mean, the sad part is that that's a lot of what fantasy feels like nowadays. It just
especially
feels like
video
an
games.
extended D&D game.
But to bring it full circle, I think Sanderson would say amen.
Right.
And I think he's saying that in order to be interesting and make us look at our world with fresh eyes, we need to have different extrapolations, and not just maybe the medieval kind of, like there's a trunk, which would be like Tolkien, and then there's like him with the masters, but then be like, well, you've got this, maybe this branch. There's a lot of trees that have, the trunk divides into 2 or 3. So we're looking at it and saying, well, okay, for us to have to say epic fantasy, is in some ways a recognition of the fact that there's a lot of fantasy that is just what Corey was talking about. And I think, I mean, my preference, of course, is that it is epic. Otherwise, it doesn't really lift me above the world. Beowulf is great. Why is Beowulf great? I think because in his story, we're like, oh man, Hrothgar, he's in trouble. What are you gonna do? I mean, if it was nowadays, it'd just be like, well, Hrothgar gets killed off by his rival. And no, it's like there's this golden hall, and it should make us wish that we could be there. And Beowulf comes and he rescues. He defeats Grendel, and then you've got the dragon later on. So there's all these motifs.
But there's this nobility in this tragedy, and they're not conflicting, that Tolkien has, that is really hard for other people to emulate, because the characters, they can fall. Frodo
Boromir.
failed at the very end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the point I'm trying to make is that there was still nobility in
Yes.
in the Hobbit, in Frodo,
Yes.
by not using the ring and holding on to it and traveling with it, even though it was a terrible burden that he had to carry into the enemy's camp, essentially. Right. And I mean, that shows nobility. That shows something different than what we see in normal days. The word nobility has pretty much been thrown out the window. We talk about being people who are polite, or people who are, but nobility just gets lost in the shuffle.
There's a key theme in Tolkien's works, which is ennoblement, right?
Yeah.
Where you have those who have, because of great personal sacrifice, right, they are ennobled. You have the elf friends or whatever, and I think there's something really beautiful about that. And if I can just take that and kind of take us to the next step here. Beauty, no, I completely agree. Nobility, tragedy, heroism, and I would just say beauty, because fairy, there is an ache. What Lewis and Tolkien were getting at, where it was saying there is something here. It's not just satisfied by mere knowledge,
Right.
but something that knowledge cannot possess. So that we'll leave it there, put a pin in this, and we'll come back next month for Robert Jordan, we'll be talking about him. So it is 2:30, and I'm going to ask if we can read a letter. Is that
Yes.
good? So let's
Well, I
go ahead.
wanted to ask a quick question. Did you guys have a discussion about the Lord of the Rings on Amazon stuff?
Not this month. So you can definitely bring that up. Let's read the letter, and then would you
Okay.
like to share an update?
Well, I just think it's interesting that.
Would you like to share an update after the?
Oh,
letter?
okay. Okay, which letter is that?
We are at 191.
191.
And again, if you want to send your email to us, Gary, I can send you the letter ahead of time so you have that text.
Okay, send it to you or send it to Doc?
Well, you can send it to me. My email is just, I don't know if you can see actually in the chat. Could you just type in my email there for him? B. Hughesland.
I got the screen up. And,
you don't see the live chat?
Just tell me. I'll ask you to give it a veto phonetics.
Okay, yeah. B, yeah, Bravo. First letter's B.
Yeah.
And then my last name is Hughesland. That's H as in Howard, U, S as in Samuel, E. That's after the S comes an E, L, A, N, D. Hughesland.
Okay, and there's no period between B and Hughesland?
Nope. And it's at gmail.com.
Okay, I got it.
All right. Who would like to read a portion of letter 191? Is this a big or a small one?
Oh.
That's okay. Want me to read?
Sure. Why don't you read some, and then Anthony can read some too if it gets a little long.
From a letter to Miss J. Byrne, draft.
Can you hear us, Gary?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
If you reread all the passages dealing with Frodo and the ring, I think you will see that not only was it quite impossible for him to surrender the ring in an act of will, especially at its point of maximum power, but that this failure was adumbrated. I've never heard of that word. From
Uh,
far back.
what does
he
that
was-
mean again?
I can.
He was honored because he had accepted the burden voluntarily and had then done all that was within his utmost physical and mental strength to do. He and the cause were saved by mercy, by the supreme value and efficacy of pity and forgiveness of injury.
Okay.
Corinthians.
Hold on a second. Did you?
Yeah, so adumbrate means to kind of represent an outline or faintly. Comes from the Latin word umbra, which means shade or shadow.
Okay, so that's kind of like foreshadowed would
Yeah.
be another way.
Okay.
So this failure was foreshadowed from far back. Okay.
Corinthians 1:12-13 may not at first sight seem to fit, unless bearing temptation is taken to mean resisting it while still a free agent in a normal command of the will. I think rather of the mysterious last petitions of the Lord's Prayer. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. A petition against something that cannot happen is unmeaning. There exists the possibility of being placed in positions beyond one's power, in which case, as I believe, salvation from ruin will depend on something apparently unconnected, the general sanctity and humility and mercy of the sacrificial person. I did not arrange the deliverance in this case. It again follows the logic of the story. Gollum had his chance of repentance and of returning generosity with love and had fallen off the knife edge. In the case of those who now issue from prison brainwashed, broken, or insane, praising their torturers, no such immediate deliverance is a rule to be seen, but we can at least judge them by the will and intentions with which they entered the Samath Nar.
That's the crack of doom, the gateway into Mount Doom.
Oh, okay. And not demand impossible feats of will, which could only happen in stories unconcerned with real moral and mental probability. No.
That's interesting because you think about a lot of the superhero stories nowadays, they really are about impossible feats of will, right? I mean, they're
Well, I think we still struggle with the whole idea of the Greek Hercules.
uh-huh.
I think that's the hardest thing. Even Samson is. There's a lot of people out there that are patting Samson on the back, even though God was pretty rough with Samson, to be honest. And they look at Samson and go, "Well, he did run around killing off all these bad guys for us."
Well, Samson's kind of a Turin Turambar, I think, in some ways.
Anyways, no, Frodo failed. It is possible that once the ring was destroyed, he had little recollection of the last scene, but one must face the fact the power of evil in the world is not finally resistible by incarnate creatures, however good, and the writer of the story is not one of us. See, not to talk about getting into the Catholic. If you don't like Catholicism, you might as well go home.
Well, there's broader things here, though.
I know. I'm
because
just saying.
I'm pointing out that, I mean, he's drawing from his faith, but that even as a Protestant, I'm not a Catholic, but I think I understand what he's saying.
Well, yeah, I do too. I'm not saying it's negative. I just think it's interesting that he's very so open about how it influences his work.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I am afraid I have the same feeling. I have been forced to publish upside down or backwards. And after the grand cash and the end of the end of the visibly incarnate evil before the dominion of man, or simply history, which it all led up, the mythical and elvish legends of the elder days will not be quite the same, but perhaps read eventually from beginning to end in the right order, both parts may gain. I am not writing the Silmarillion, which was so long ago written, but trying to find a way and an order in which to make the legends and the animals publishable, and I have a dreadful lot of other work to do as well.
And that's, of course, referring to the fact that the Silmarillion was not published until 1977,
Yep.
After Tolkien's death. So it was. So he, of course, didn't get it published in his lifetime, did he?
No.
Well, it's
But
kind of interesting. If you start reading from the Silmarillion comes off very, very mythological.
Yeah.
But then you get into the ages of men, where the elves are fewer and far between, and it becomes more and more history like.
Mhm.
Yeah. Have you guys read the latest book by Tolkien, The Nature of Middle Earth, edited by Carl Hostetter?
No.
Yeah, it's I read the first couple chapters. It's really good so far. It's just, he goes into extraordinary detail because he's basically represent some of his last writings on Middle Earth, basically from the time he retired from his professorship at Oxford
Okay.
in like 1909. And listen to the first couple chapters. Tolkien really goes into extraordinary detail about some of the chronology as well as the kind of the philosophical underpinnings of his work. So maybe if you might want to call it theological. Like I'm on a chapter regarding the Elves Awakening by the late Vienen.
Yes.
And just reading from that chapter, I feel like connecting it to what he's saying in the letter, like I think it feels like that describing the Elves Awakening is kind of like this Edenic type of period where the elves were just awakening. They were
Starlight.
fresh faced. They were just starting to learn learn how to speak.
Darkness was not evil to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it really wasn't until they had gotten to Valinor and they like in particular the kinslaying of Aqualande, where the Noldor slew the Teleri so they could steal their ships, is kind of when they started to really fall.
Yeah.
And I think Tolkien really talks about the fall in that sense when he's talking about Frodo and the Ring, because I feel like the Ring for Tolkien represents original sin and temptation, because
right.
At least in
when we come to this point that everyone will fall, essentially.
Yeah, and that there's always going to be part of us that's evil, no matter how good we are, because we're descendants of Adam and Eve. At least Catholics believe that.
Well, I believe that too.
Yeah.
But there's hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. There's always some sort of redeeming quality about us, I think.
Right. Or a Valinor, as it were, some world in which that is then removed so that we can have peace. So that's really interesting, because I have not read, but you're saying it's worthwhile getting.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Yeah, Hofstadter. I know that Christopher Tolkien, while he was still alive, had said that he was very happy with the Hofstadter being chosen as the editor. So that's what made me feel positive about it. And the last book, really, the last probably book that's directly got the stamp of approval from father and son. Anything else you want to share there?
No, I don't think so. Were you gonna say something, Corey?
I was just thinking of how Tolkien considered the gift of language as a indicator of a intelligent, not intelligent, but not a beast. That's language separated us from the beasts in some ways. That was the whole point of the elves, where they were known for their tongues, their ability to create and name the things. So it kind of parallels Adam's ability to name the animals at the beginning of Genesis.
Right, language, of course, always very important to Tolkien. Gary, did you have any comments on that letter? We could read maybe one more letter after this. Did you have any?
Not at all. I thought the whole thing was interesting. At the beginning, when we were talking about Frodo in the Mount Doom, and where he was, he intended, I think, to get rid of the ring and couldn't do it at the end.
Right.
The person, the most noble, we were talking about that, turns out to be Samwise Gamgee, who is there. But you have, I agree with your thoughts that they still did the little things, as Gandalf would say, and make all the difference. And they got that part, and fate intervened, either through a higher power or whatever.
Well, the pity of Bilbo.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The whole thing started, and also right there in Mount Doom, both Frodo and Gollum fell.
Yeah.
And luckily for Frodo, he was holding on, even though he was missing a finger.
Right. Anthony.
Well, there's a footnote to Tolkien referencing in the Corinthians.
Okay.
Bible
sure.
verse. Do you want me to read that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Corinthians.
First Corinthians.
1 Corinthians, chapter 10, verses 12 and 13.
Hmm?
Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. There hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, and that ye may be able to bear it.
Yeah, so I think obviously he was saying, well, it seems like then if that's true, then the kind of the idea in the story, then Frodo should have been able to, but he's saying, well, there's sometimes an evil so strong that perhaps no one can pass this on their own. They need fate to intervene. They need divine, power, really, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they need to lean on something bigger than themselves, right?
Yeah.
But Frodo didn't really have
They
that.
have a choice.
Right,
I mean,
right.
Frodo
Well,
have a choice at the end.
and in a sense, it just still says that God provides a way. So it still has to be provided from outside us. But would you like to read 192? It's a short letter, Anthony, if you want.
Let's see.
And this is from a letter to Amy Ronald, 27th of July, 1956.
By chance, I have just had another letter regarding the failure of Frodo. Very few seem to even have observed it, but following the logic of the plot, it was clearly inevitable as an event. Surely it is a more significant and real event than a mere fairy story ending in which the hero is indomitable. It is possible for the good, even the saintly, to be subjected to a power of evil which is too great for them to overcome in themselves. In this case, the cause, or not the hero, was triumphant, because by the exercise of pity, mercy, and forgiveness of injury, a situation was produced in which all was redressed and disaster averted. Gandalf certainly foresaw this. See Volume 1, pages 68 and 69. I think referencing the Fellowship of the Ring.
Yeah. And I think it's that when they were in Moria in that comment about the pity of Bilbo.
Yeah, Gandalf says, "Pity, it was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil, and escaped in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity." Back to the letter. Of course, he did not mean to say that one must be merciful, for it may prove useful later. It would not then be mercy or pity, which are only truly present when contrary to prudence. Not ours to plan, but we are assured that we must be ourselves extravagantly generous, if we are to hope for the extravagant generosity which the slightest easing of or escape from the consequences of our own follies and errors represents. That mercy does sometimes occur in this life. Frodo deserved all honor because he spent every drop of his power of will and body, and that was just sufficient to bring him to the destined point, and no further. Few others, possibly no others of his time, would have got so far. The other power then took over, the writer of the story, by which I do not mean myself, that one ever-present person who is never absent and never named, footnote 60, where he says, actually referred to as the One, I think he's talking about Iluvatar, in Appendix A, Volume 3, page 317, note 1 and 20, the Numenorians and Elves were absolute monotheists. Back to the letter. Now, as one critic has said, see Volume 1, page 65, I assume that's Fellowship.
But a monotheist is something that we see in other mythologies that don't necessarily mess around with the idea of Trinity. So that it's interesting that, in his mythology, he only has one.
Well, because he's applicability, not allegory, right?
Yeah. And the Fellowship reference Tolkien's talking about is where Gandalf says to Frodo, behind that there was something else at work. Beyond any design of the Ringmaker, I could put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker.
And that is some comfort.
Back to the letter. A third, the only other commentator on the point some months ago, reviled Frodo as a scoundrel and who should have been hung and not honored.
Oh!
What? And me too.
Wow.
And it seems sad and strange that in this evil...
and did he say, and me too?
Yeah, he didn't talk about...
What? So
hanging Tolkien.
Oh my goodness.
It seems sad and strange that in this evil time when daily people of goodwill are tortured, brainwashed, and broken, anyone could be so fiercely simple-minded and self-righteous. I do not think Walter de la Mare walked in my country, whether you mean read my work before he died, or inhabited a similar world, or both. I only met him once, many years ago, and we had little to say, but as far as my feelings for and understanding of his work goes, I should guess that he inhabited a much darker and more hopeless world. One anyway that alarms me profoundly.
Ooh, little breadcrumb trail there. That'd be interesting to find out. Okay, so Walter de la Mare, what has he written?
Let's look it up.
Nothing. Nothing important.
But a much darker and more hopeless world.
Oh, he was an English poet, short story writer, and novelist. He's best remembered for his works for children, for his poem *The Listeners*, and for a highly acclaimed selection of subtle psychological horror stories, amongst them *Satan's Aunt* and *All Hallows*. Wikipedia page.
Very relevant at this time of the year.
Yeah.
Little Halloween.
Yeah.
Jumped into Halloween just then.
Yeah. A much darker, more hopeless world, by which then we would say the opposite is true, that Tolkien, he's talking about his fictional world, right?
Yeah.
That Tolkien's world is meant to be a world that has more hope in the face of darkness, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Well, thank you for reading that, Anthony. Did anybody have any comments on that letter? Else they wanted to bring up? Pretty harsh critics that he faced, huh?
Oh yeah.
Frodo didn't do it. He should have been hung. And you too, Tolkien.
Is that
Oh,
correct?
ouch.
That's what I would say.
Yeah. That's. Oh
Man, Tolkien must have had a thick skin to be able to.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
yeah.
kind of a death threat,
You
isn't it?
would think
Yeah.
that mercy and pity, boy, that was what he was talking about.
Yes. Rules
and
the
the guy-
day.
And what does the guy say? No mercy, no pity. Off with his head.
Yes. Yeah. That's.
It was what, 50s, so it's
Oh yeah, you were probably alive.
different attitudes there. Yeah.
True.
Oh,
True. I do like the idea, though, that he seems to be saying, look, there's something more ultimate and greater than just courage itself. To get to Mordor, to get to Mount Doom, to throw in the ring. There's something even greater than that, and that is pity, and also mercy and forgiveness of injury. I'm assuming the forgiveness of injury is referring to, because pity, I'm thinking it's Bilbo's pity, because Bilbo pitied Gollum.
Yeah.
He didn't kill him when he had the ring on, way back in The Hobbit. But what he's referring to there with forgiveness of injury, I'm not sure.
well,
that-
the fact that Gollum died at the end, but it was used to avert disaster.
Right.
There's a redemption. I mean, there's a lot of people out there, but probably don't like the redemption story because it forces you to recognize your limitations
Sure.
and the fact that you have something bigger that you have to connect with, I guess,
Right.
to assume that it's not just fate, because fate would be
Mm-hmm.
kind of like cause and effect, the great chain that Chesterton likes to talk about, great chain of causation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think that it's not fate. It's the idea that there's a bigger context for the ring being destroyed.
Trying to find actual reference here, because it seems to be specifically, you mentioned the disaster averted there, Corey. It says, okay, so in the letter it says, in this case, the cause, not the hero, was triumphant. So the cause was triumphant because by the exercise of pity, mercy, and forgiveness and injury, a situation was produced in which all was redressed and disaster averted. So this to me seems to say that before Gollum bites off Frodo's finger, before this happens, pity, mercy, and forgiveness of injury made this situation possible. So that's what I'm wondering about is, in Mount Doom, you have, okay, this might be what it's referring to. Remember that outside the mountain, on the volcano's side, Gollum attacks them.
Right.
And it says here, Frodo, they're fighting, and then Frodo flung him off and rose up quivering, and then he said, down, you creeping thing, and out of my path. Your time is at an end. You cannot betray me or slay me now. And then Sam saw these two rivals with another vision, and so he saw a creature now wholly ruined and defeated, yet filled with a hideous lust and rage. And then before it stood stern, untouchable now by pity, a figure robed in white, but at its breast it held a wheel of fire. And he says, Frodo says, "Begone and trouble me no more. Touch me ever again, you shall be cast yourself into the fire of doom." Interesting words. And then the next part says, after Frodo leaves, Sam says, "Look out, he'll spring." He stepped forward, brandishing his sword. "Quick, master," he gasped. Go on, no time to lose. I'll deal with them, go on." And so Frodo goes up the mountain with his last strength. And then Sam says, "Now," said Sam, "at last I can deal with you." He leaped forward with drawn blade, ready for battle. But imagine how this could have ended, right?
With Sam going over the edge, you mean?
Sam could have killed him. And how would that have changed the end of the story?
Oh.
So listen to this. But Gollum did not spring. He fell flat upon the ground and whimpered. "Don't kill us," he wept. "Don't hurt us with nasty, cruel steel. Let us live, yes, live just a little longer. Lost. We're lost, and when Precious goes, we'll die. Yes, die into the dust." He clawed up the ashes of the path with his long, fleshless fingers. "Dust," he hissed. Sam's hand wavered. His mind was hot with wrath and the memory of evil. It would be memory of evil. What had Gollum done to Sam? He'd hit him.
He lied about it to Frodo, remember?
Yes. The betrayal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Before Shelob's lair, right. So, wait, no, that's in the movie, not in the...
I'm not sure. I haven't read that.
There's betrayal. There's betrayal. He was calling
Sam?
No.
Frodo?
Gollum. He kept calling Gollum names, remember?
Right.
And he just never gave it over. And then Gollum finally gave in to the side that...
Yes, exactly. So following on from this, he says, Sam was hot with wrath and the memory of evil. It would be just to slay this treacherous, murderous creature, and just and many times deserved, and also it seemed the only safe thing to do. But deep in his heart there was something that restrained him. He could not strike this thing lying in the dust, forlorn, ruinous, and utterly wretched. He himself, though only for a little while, had borne the ring, and now dimly he guessed the agony of Gollum's shriveled mind and body, enslaved to that ring, unable to find peace or relief ever in life again. But Sam had no words to express what he felt. "Oh, curse you, you stinking thing," he said. "Go away. Be off. I don't trust you, not as far as I could kick you. But be off, or I shall hurt you, yes, with nasty, cruel steel." Gollum got up on all fours and backed away for several paces, and then he turned, and as Sam aimed a kick at him, he fled away down the path. Sam gave no more heed to them. He suddenly remembered his master. And then, of course, he runs up. That's when Gollum, does turn and follow. So I think maybe, I'm just saying, that might be what it's referring to here. In it says that the cause was triumphant because by the exercise of pity, mercy, and forgiveness of injury. So in a sense, I think Sam... Maybe there was a sense in which he was like, "Look, you've done all this to us, but I'm going to let you go. I'm going to let you live," right?
Well, and think about that. Think about that for just a minute. Most of us do not. I think it was C.S. Lewis that said, when we're younger, we want justice, but when we get older, mercy, mercy, mercy.
Yeah.
And the problem is that I think a lot of people look at it and look at this mercy, the sense of mercy as how do you redeem mercy for somebody who's pretty much gone over the edge and he hasn't? I mean, essentially, that story wouldn't make any sense without.
Somebody is not redeemable.
Yeah.
Irredeemable.
Yeah. Well, if that hadn't been there, then Frodo would have kept the ring.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have been destroyed, and Sauron would be triumphant.
He would have taken it. Yep. Absolutely. So you're right, Gary, that Sam really was the key there. But it's the pity that was in Sam. It even says it there that that pity kind of in a sense deep in his heart there was something restrained him. And I think the fact that he had borne the ring and knew that the pain of it, in a way, gave way to mercy.
Well, the burden of it. I mean,
what would this be like if I carried this?
Well, he wore it around his neck, but he said, it was that Frodo was lighter than the ring was the way is kind of described. It's like he's trudging up this hill and he's not having any problems with Frodo's body.
Yeah.
Physically, he's fine with that. It's the ring that's dragging him down.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
you know, I mean, think about the burden
Mm-hmm.
of sin. I guess is
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. So, Corey, do you want to just maybe end with an update? Did you have anything?
Oh
you
well,
wanted
I
to
was
share?
just wondering if anybody else saw the article on the internet about the first Black Hobbit.
Oh yeah.
There was a essay or something, I don't know exactly, but it was talking about how they're going to have a Hobbit in the new movie and he's going to be black.
Yeah.
I don't know
Interesting.
if that is an open conversation about whether or not there were hobbits of such color in the early days.
Sure.
I'm not here to
That's
say
interesting. I mean, I think it I know that they were going to try to explore the cultural, like the very distant genetic ancestors of the hobbits. So yeah. I haven't read it myself, but I can include it on the notes.
No, I was just thinking next week we could ask
Next month.
Huh?
Next month.
Next month. I'm sorry.
That's
Sure.
Next month we can always go over it a little bit
Okay.
and just have a discussion about that. Because it kind of falls in the same area with Tolkien's just in for the blonde hair and blue eyes and
Well, there is a passage in the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring where Tolkien says on page 12, concerning hobbits, there were a group of hobbits who were browner of skin, that they moved westward early. And I'm just reading this from an article on the onering.net. I can send it to you if you want.
That'd be good. Thanks for bringing that up, Corey. I'd like to read it and maybe we can comment on it next month. We'll also be talking about Tolkien and again, just taking another author after Tolkien, Robert Jordan. And the reason why is because, again, sometimes we learn more about an author by putting him side to side with other authors. With writers after Tolkien, I think it is worthwhile to say, what debt does this author owe, if anything, to Tolkien? And then do they have anything unique that people wanted to share? And I think that would be worthwhile to do it next month.
So we're talking about Robert Jordan next month? Or?
Robert Jordan.
Okay.
Yep.
You guys ever heard of Raymond D. Feist?
Yeah,
I know who.
actually have.
Yeah. He wrote the Rift War saga, of which I've read the first book called Magician.
Okay.
And it's interesting. I'd love to talk about him at some point.
Yeah, so that's another thing, is just for all of us to be thinking, if we know of, and again, this is not meant to be just authors that, like, say, I don't really want to spend a month on Philip Pullman.
Yeah.
but like those who have also, perhaps we feel like, is there anyone alive today or let's just say after Tolkien, who got the closest to the feel of what Tolkien wrote. So that's something we can definitely, I would love more ideas for the future.
I think the thing is Robert Jordan's a little bit different. And
of course.
But I do
This
feel
guy's
like
different.
I do feel that Robert Jordan captured a lot of people's hearts and minds with his books.
Right?
Unlike Pullman. I mean, Pullman has his own saga, but I actually feel bad that he died before finishing, because
Jordan?
we really didn't get to see his ending. And
Right.
I think the wrapping up, Sanderson, I feel bad for him that he had all that
Yeah.
work to do. But
Yeah, because really, unless you are the one who starts the story, I don't think you can really finish it well. But we'll save that till next month, which will be the third Saturday in November. I believe that would be. Let's just see here. I think it's the Saturday before Thanksgiving. Yep, it's the 20th. So November 20 will be our next meeting.
we're going to have turkey.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
I'll bring a can of
With
cranberry.
all the trimmings. Roast chicken.
Any last comments, Gary, before we sign off?
No, it's been enjoyable, and I really like hearing all your interpretations of what's going on. Thanks for educating me. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here.
Yep.
Yep.
Good to see you.
No problem. Actually,
All right.
I want to be now than I was before.
Yay.
It's great to see you again, Gary, and do send me an email. I'll make sure to include that link.
I will.
All right. Yep. Take
Yep.
care. Bye-bye.
Namarie.
Wherever you are, Namarie.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. I think we just click on end stream.
Yes.
Okay. No longer be live. Oops.
Yeah, that's what
I'm
it's
not
supposed
live anymore.
I'm alive.